Hello, in this video I want to talk about the inner ear. The inner ear is located within the petrous part of the temporal bone, the slide you are observing. The petrous part of the temporal bone is shown and some of its important components of. This slide is composed of bone tissue. These are all bone tissues. However, within this bone tissue, you can see spaces that are occupied by components of the inner ear. In the main part of this region, you can observe a structure that we identify as the cochlea. The cochlea is shaped like a snail. And when you take a cross-section, you can see a structure very similar to a cross-section of a snail, as shown here. Here is the cochlear canal, also known as the cochlear duct. It makes 2 3/4 turns around the central bony core called the modiolus. The modiolus is also made of bone tissue, as you can see here, but it contains pores or openings. That has the spiral ganglion and blood vessels. The spiral ganglion naturally has a snail-like shape, and this part of the cochlea is also spiral-shaped, which you can observe in cross-sections. If we look at one of these canals, which we know as the cochlear canal, it runs like a tunnel within the bony tissue in a spiral form. Let's zoom in for a closer look, and we can see that it is made up of different components. In fact, this canal is divided into 2 sections by a bony plate called the osseous spiral lamina. The modiolus acts like a screw, and the osseous spiral lamina consists of plates that attach to the axis of the screw, forming a spiral pattern. You can see one of its cross-sections here, the next cross-section here, and here, and it is also visible above these levels. So the cochlea is part of the osseous labyrinth, a space within the bone. It is supported by a layer of periosteum, which is a connective tissue layer. This periosteal layer starts to extend inward toward the cochlear space and attaches to the free edge of the osseous spiral lamina. The presence of these 2 structures, the osseous spiral lamina and this connective tissue, known as the spiral ligament, divides the cochlea into 2 sections. The upper section accommodates a portion of the membranous labyrinth. The membranous labyrinth is arranged as a tube which, as you can see, is spirally positioned in the middle part of the cochlea. In cross-section, it has a triangular shape, and because it lies between 2 channels of the osseous labyrinth, it is known as the scala media. Another name for the scala media is the cochlear duct. The lower tunnel or channel is called the scala tympani, and the upper channel is called the scala vestibuli. Both of these compartments belong to the osseous labyrinth. They are filled with perilymph, whereas the scala media belongs to the membranous labyrinth and is filled with endolymph. If we examine this region at higher magnification, we can see that the scala media in cross-section looks like a triangular shape with 3 sides. The upper side, which is a thin membrane, separates the scala media from the scala vestibuli and is known as the vestibular membrane. The vestibular membrane is composed of 2 layers of simple squamous epithelium. You can observe here. Between these 2 epithelial layers, there is also a thin layer of connective tissue, the layer facing the scala vestibuli. It has a mesenchymal origin, while the layer facing the scala media has an ectodermal origin and is derived from the otic flacode. The outer wall is called the stria vascularis. The stria vascularis is a specialized epithelium that, unlike other epithelia, contains capillaries within it. Although the epithelial cells present here are specialized, they are connected to each other by tight junctions, which prevent any substances from the blood vessels from entering. The scala media, in fact, the stria vascularis, is responsible for the ionic regulation of the endolymph. The lower side contains an important structure known as the organ of Corti that lies adjacent to this structure. The specialized structure that you can see here, it's called the spiral limbus, and you can also observe in other sections, if you examine the spiral limbus at higher magnification, you will see that it is a connective tissue structure covered on its surface by an epithelium. The epithelial cells covering this surface secrete the tectorial membrane. This membrane that you see here is the tectorial membrane. Under normal conditions, the tectorial membrane overlies the organ of Corti. But here, in tissue preparations, it has been slightly displaced as an artifact. The tectorial membrane is a cellular and consists of extracellular matrix composed of proteoglycans, glycoproteins, and fine collagen fibers. The epithelium covering the spiral limbus continues and extends as a border cells which form the inner boundary of the organ of Corti. These are supporting cells on the inner side in this region. You can see a triangular-shaped canal known as the inner tunnel. The walls of this inner tunnel are formed by the pillar cells. The pillar cells have a cell body containing the nucleus. And to processes, these processes extend toward each other and connect at the bottom and at the top. On both sides of the inner tunnel, we can observe rows of inner and outer hair cells. The inner row consists of a single row, which is supported by a supporting cell called the phalangeal cell. The phalangeal cell is also a supporting cell that supports the inner hair cell. On the outer side, you can see 3 to 5 rows of outer hair cells. In this section, 3 rows are visible. The nuclei seen here belong to the phalangeal cells of the outer hair cells, which support hair cells. These phalangeal cells have several processes that extend toward the apex of hair cells and connect with the apices of the hair cells as well as with the pillar cells and inner hair cells, forming a layer called the reticular lamina, because the cells in the reticular lamina are tightly connected to each other by tight junctions. This layer creates a barrier against the passage of ions whose concentration is much higher in the endolymph than in these internal spaces. Beyond this, we again see a series of border cells, which are supporting cells that eventually connect with the stria vascularis. The space located between the hair cells is known as null space. On this side, within the modiolus, you can also observe the spiral ganglion. The spiral ganglion consists of neurons with clearly visible nuclei and nucleoli, and a number of satellite cells can also be seen among them. This structure represents the cochlea. However, below this, you can also see part of the utricle. The utricle is lined by a simple squamous epithelium. But in this region, the epithelium becomes taller, forming a structure known as the macula. The macula consists of hair cells and their supporting cells. The taller epithelium seen here is, in fact, the macula.